Hello and welcome to the UKSIF's Leadership Podcast. For today's episode, we're pleased to bring you one of our sessions from our spring conference, which took place last week in Edinburgh. I was delighted to be joined by some excellent speakers to talk about Scotland's future beyond oil and gas. This was a brilliant session and we hope you enjoy it. In a very effective way. To my left, Libby, Watkinson, Director for Impact Assessment and Reporting at the Scottish National Investment Bank. Libby has a decade of experience within the banking industry and a further 5 as a social researcher, and is currently Director of Impact within the bank, where she focuses on ways in which investment can bring positive social and environmental impacts alongside commercial returns. Previously, Libby was at NatWest Group, leading on a range of sustainable elements. Next is Theodor, Cojoianu, who's Associate Professor in Sustainable Finance at the University of Edinburgh Business School and Director of Research at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and also serves with me on the Green Technical Advisory Group, advising the Treasury on the green taxonomy. Theodor's work is at the intersection between sustainability, data science and finance, and he's focused on applying innovative research methods to the study of sustainable development issues. Theodor is also a member of the European Commission's platform on sustainable finance, which I think is probably a lot harder than the Green Technical Advisory Group, is my understanding at least. And then finally, Ian Stannard, who is Sustainable Finance Business Development with ICE. Ian joined ICE's Sustainable Finance team following the acquisition of the climate transition risk specialist Argentum, where he was the head of marketing and engagement. Ian has extensive experience developing and producing thought leadership, macro research and data products for global financial market participants. So, brilliant panel, I'm really excited. So maybe we'll start with a couple of minutes from each of you on the big picture. What is Scotland's direction of travel? How is the country moving forwards? Where do you see things going for net zero in Scotland? Libby, start with you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks very much, everyone, for coming along. So, I mean, I guess from my perspective, there is huge potential in Scotland. You know, I mean, we've got such strength within renewable energy, and we're seeing a lot of interest in that area. We've also got very rich natural resources as well, and I understand you will have heard a little bit about this yesterday if you were here. You know, we've got those natural resources that we can use as part of the transition to net zero, but we need to be thoughtful about how we are using those so that we don't deplete them in search of solutions to other problems that we're facing. We also have some really interesting social frameworks in Scotland as well, which I think are going to be fundamental to developing that just transition to net zero. So we have things like the Just Transition Commission in Scotland. We've got the thinking around it being a well-being economy. We've got our fair work principles. And all of these are going to be absolutely foundational in achieving a fair and equitable transition that is actually sustainable for the country. I guess on that point as well, geographically, we've got quite a few challenges. We've got some very remote and very rural communities, but actually just through the transition, we can help to address some of the inequalities that those communities are facing currently. If I take the example of digital connectivity, you know, the more that we can connect those communities digitally, they will be open to some of the opportunities that connectivity can bring. And then, of course, there are benefits from a net zero perspective as well. So we've got all of these things at our fingertips, alongside, of course, Scotland's rich history in innovation, and for that innovation being used domestically, but also then exported as expertise in different sectors, which, you know, we have a very strong reputation in. And then finally, of course, financial services. Again, a very long and rich history in financial services in this country, including green finance. So to me, it feels like we've got all of these building blocks, all of these strengths that we could potentially be harnessing. No doubt all sorts of challenges and barriers that we will face along the way, but I'm actually very positive about the future that we have for the transition in Scotland and for making sure that that is fair, equitable and sustainable for everyone. Brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent. I agree with the optimism, although I have prepared a slightly more pessimistic view on where we stand. In particular with regards to the North Sea. So I very much agree. We have so many success stories. So Scotland's grid is under 50 grams of CO2e per kilowatt hour, which is very, very green. Just to give you a sense, the green taxonomy in Europe considers 100 grams of CO2e per kilowatt hour as the threshold for greenness. So we're even half that. It's amazing. But it's really hard to push the whole of Scotland as a model. And this is, I think, even from the perspective of a country, to say the entire model should be copied, because just this morning I was reading that 10 billion in greenfield capex for oil and gas will be invested this year in the North Sea. And till 2025, we're talking about a figure of about 30 billion. So we have a huge challenge in that if you look at the numbers and what is happening in terms of investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure is not aligned with a net zero, and I'm not sure it's just for the entire planet, because obviously if you don't have a pathway to net zero, it's not about how just it is for oil and gas workers, but for everyone in the world, right? So we often kind of contrast the well-being of people locally in this industry with the well-being of the entire planetary system. So where do I see it going? I'd like to position this, or at least my contribution in this panel, a bit on the perspective of what can investors do, since we have so many members here from financial services. There is this key question: what do you do when a state could be, in Scotland, could be anywhere in the world, gives the go-ahead for pathways to not be net zero aligned, right? And I think the first important thing is for us to learn, and how are these fossil fuel projects financed? When you look at it, it's mostly through debt products. So for anyone working in fixed income, also in banks themselves, lending products are hugely important, particularly on bond and overall corporate bonds and overall corporate loans. And yeah, I think if I can start with this with a slightly, maybe not so optimistic, in that we're investing this amount of money, and I'm not sure we're there yet, but I'm going to pose it as a question, and I have a few answers. I'd love to hear from the public or fellow panelists on how we get there.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
We'll definitely pick up that point in a second. Ian.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I agree with all those comments, and I think Scotland is a great case study for the transition for a number of reasons. Obviously, we have the oil and gas sector, which is it's not just huge, but a huge part of the Scottish economy as well. So that makes it a challenge before we even start. But then there are some positives which has been noted as well, which are key for the transition. The first of which is the very highly developed and sophisticated financial sector, particularly focused on asset owners and asset managers, which are going to be key for funding the transition as well. So you have that in place here. And as been mentioned as well, with the natural resources and nature-based solutions on the doorstep as well. So I think all of those are encouraging, but Scotland hasn't really is not making it easy for itself, though, with regards to the targets and the time frame that it's set itself. It's decided to sort of stand out from the crowd by setting far more aggressive targets to decarbonise more quickly than most of the other countries as well. So it's actually going to be a very, very tough and sort of challenging time to push through this this transition. And as we heard from some earlier panelists, Catherine talking about green bonds and talking about some of the issues we're having with regards to supply chains and with green skills to around some of the key elements of the transition as well. So it does. There are plenty of challenges in place, and on top of that, we still have that inconsistency with the investment still going into fossil fuels as well. So I think it's a really interesting case study, and I think if Scotland can get it right, then it actually provides a real sort of blueprint for everyone else.
I think that's a really important point. This is, the transition that can lead and drive the way. And so what does that transition then look like? What does oil and gas or the kind of the industry that's currently oil and gas in Scotland look like? What's the vision for how the North Sea, I suppose, looks? And crucially, I think to Theodor's point earlier, what is the role of financial services in making that change happen and in creating that shift? Maybe, Theodor, do you want to go first on that? You said you had some thoughts and ideas, so I'm keen to hear them. You promised ideas.
Controversial. So I think there's a few layers to it. A few of them probably some low-hanging fruit. Typically, when we were talking about the divestment movement or even debt denial, right? Debt denial is much more interesting than divestment because, yes, we have all of these assets that we're currently invested in, and the capex has been raised, the asset is there, it's operating. There's not much you can do from an investor activity, right? And you can't shut it down, unless, yes, shutting it down would make sense, but you'll have big discussions. The first thing would be to understand from an investor perspective, in private equity, if you look in the North Sea, you have, yes, these big operators, you would have Equinor, you would have BP, but you would have a lot of private equity or kind of these smaller rig operators that, you know, you could have some serious discussions around when they come to banks, right, to look for debt. And we are in the Lloyd's building. You know, Lloyd's, for example, committed to not financing project finance, right? So when you bundle all projects under this bespoke SPV, but there's not many banks that said we are not financing even fossil fuel companies or general capex. We're not giving loans for general capex that could be used for oil projects. So on the due diligence, low-hanging fruit side, I don't think we have that mapping done, or financial institutions don't do it as deeply yet. That's the low-hanging fruit, and maybe we can come back later to some ideas on, okay, what do you do with sovereigns? And I heard there was a recurring theme, but I would say first, let's pay attention to private equity, but also on the bond side of the large operators.
Really interesting, and yeah, that kind of where. So I think somebody said yesterday it's about where does new lending come in, and new debt instruments, and that's a key part of it. I'm going to come to you in a second, but just to get Ian's thoughts on that side of it, and then I want to talk about the kind of public sector finance role.
Yeah, obviously the finance industry has got a huge role to play here, so not just in Scotland, but with the transition globally. And I think one of the key things we need to start looking at is addressing the way in which the finance industry is currently looking at climate. At the moment, it's far too often when we're talking to our customers in the financial industry, they're all focused on climate risk. So all the data collection, the regulation at the moment is all focused around climate risk. It's all about reducing your climate risk, reducing your exposure to those risks, trying to reduce your carbon footprints and reduce your exposure to carbon emissions. What we believe is actually we now need to rebalance things and actually start to look at climate opportunities and investment opportunities, which is extremely important. When we sort of talk about investment more generally, we actually focus on both things. And quite often we look at the opportunity first. When asset managers, investors are looking at making an investment, the first thing they look at is the opportunity, and then they look at the risks around that. When we overlay climate on top of that, the immediate reaction is to look at the risk first, and then maybe not look at the opportunities at all. So I think that's something which needs to change, and that balance needs to change for really so the finance industry can start to really invest in the transition. And I think it is starting to change. We're seeing a lot of interest in various different concepts around climate metrics and climate products, which enables that investors to start looking and identifying those opportunities. So this can be things such as impact bonds. We're doing a lot of work with customers, even big asset owners around impact bonds, helping them to analyze those impact bonds, understand the role of those impact bonds, to measure the effectiveness of those impact bonds on a real world basis. So in pure dollar terms, how much impact are they getting for their dollar? And the other sort of concepts we're doing a lot of work around at the moment as well, particularly with impact investors, is work around avoided emissions. So this is about looking beyond your own portfolio impact on climate and looking at the impact your investments have on the broader community as well, and economy. So I think once we start to look at these kind of concepts and change our approach to investing, then a lot of these investments start to become far more attractive. So investment in a renewables project, which may not look too attractive initially because you're looking purely at the risk side of things, although it sounds great as renewables, the initial impact may be quite negative on your portfolio from various different aspects, even from a climate perspective. If it's new technology, it could have a negative impact. But if you then start to think about the future potential avoided emissions from that technology starting to be used in the future, you can actually then start to take that into account. You can actually then view your investment in a completely different light. You can actually then reassure your stakeholders that you are actually having a very positive impact on the climate transition. So I think that's going to be key over the next few years, is trying to get the investment community to switch that focus a little bit and just start to rebalance. It's not just about the risk, it's also about the opportunity.
And making that opportunity as attractive as possible, I suppose, is your job at the Scottish National Investment Bank. How do you do that? How are you making it so that you can help drive private capital flows into the things we want to see, the good things?
Yeah, and completely agree. So ultimately what we are seeing is this issue around risk, and that is absolutely acting as a drag on investment. And part of the role of public capital, and when I say public capital, just for clarity, that could be sub-commercial or grant, could also be commercial investment. So within the Scottish National Investment Bank, we invest on a commercial basis. One of the reasons why we do that is that we are looking to, yes, help to de-risk market and sectors so that other private sector players can then kind of follow in, but also to prove out the commercial case. And that is absolutely fundamental to why we exist, is to demonstrate that there are businesses, projects where you can invest on a commercial basis, achieve the returns that you would expect to achieve, but also have more positive non-financial outcomes as well. And that's a big part of what we do as an impact investor. So to your point, Theodor, around how you use finance as a lever, that is absolutely essential as part of this, is making sure that as within the investment, we are pulling those levers around ESG to ensure good compliance, but also pushing for more positive non-financial benefits along the social line, along environmental outcomes as well, and baking that into the investment. So by doing that, we can demonstrate this kind of dual benefit, if you like, of commercial and non-commercial. And ultimately, our role, as we see it, is to help to de-risk these sectors, but then in order for the private capital to come in, we look to co-invest alongside private sector as much as possible. We use very flexible terms in terms of how we structure deals as well, so that we can be quite innovative, because again, a lot of these are sort of entrenched views about what is or isn't kind of an acceptable level of risk, so we try to be innovative in our deal structures as well. And ultimately, our ideal is that sectors become sufficiently de-risked that we're not needed anymore, and then we can step out and move into another sector where the risk is still deemed to be too high.
And how you do that, and how you determine when you've reached your point of that's all working in that sector and we move on, how do you get that?
Well, so for every investment that we look at, we actually have tests in terms of whether private sector capital is actually already readily available for them. And actually part of our requirements are that we cannot be crowding out private sector capital. So we can't be competing or kind of, you know, pushing the private capital to one side. We have to be additive in our investment.
Super interesting. A really nice approach. Theodor, you talked about some of the, the licensing issues around oil and gas, why, almost on some levels, why we're still allowing it to happen. There's a macro stewardship component here. We've talked a lot about stewardship over the last couple of days. There's a piece of engagement perhaps that the industry needs to do with government and policymakers and regulators around why is this still happening? If you want to create the change, you can't just rely on financial services to be putting the money in the right place. You've got to also create the policy change. How should we go about doing that as an industry?
Yeah, I think it's a sensitive topic for many, including in, I suppose, in the platform of sustainable finance, which I have the privilege to serve. Whenever you're trying to say, technically, we can all design, if you'd like to design a sovereign debt product that would, even on secondary sovereign issuances, to say, I would like to invest in those countries that protect, have a good protected area policy, or they are decreasing their oil output over time. You can do this. Technically, it's really not hard. Start fundraising for these types of of financial products. And I think that there could be some, it could be quite some traction for them. The issue is, how do you engage, and is this really meaningful? Then, okay, you get a few billion in some funds that do that. That would be already something great that we could see soon. But practically, when will a government really take notice? Because we have this issue of, and I think we were talking on the break, to what extent you have the democratic process that has people that choose and so on that make the change versus what is the lever of the financial sector, particularly in a sector where the assets are sovereign, right? That's the key issue. The country can nationalize at any point a company and just do the project, hire the people. And I think we need to see this type of action, though. We need to see this type of engagement and lobbying, including, I know in the ESG space we complain about data issues. Then we need a collective engagement with the energy regulator to have all sorts of data sets released for, from the SMEs up to the largest emitters. And if the demand and the push is high enough, we will get there, but we need that type of concerted action to say that, we can't just have corporate disclosure for everything. We need to be also a bit smarter, because these data sets are out there. Ministries of Environment collect them, energy agencies and so on. We know because we can see them from a research perspective. I would say there is a lot of space to innovate there, although it'll require a lot of bold people, and I know there are many bold people in this field. That's why you are working in sustainable finance to take it to the next level.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, Ian, do you have some thoughts on that? What as an industry we should be saying to government and regulators? And I think importantly, it comes back to that piece of there are areas of misaligned incentives for us as financial services. We can't fix every problem, and so therefore government needs to come in, and that's partly, you talked about risk and opportunities and attractiveness. One of the risk factors surely has to be regulatory risk and policy risk. How do we, I suppose, first of all, understand what that risk is, and then actually work to use that to our advantage when it comes to choosing the good project?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because it's the relationship between policymakers and the financial industry is something which goes across not just sort of climate policy, but across all kinds of policy. And obviously, we know as investors the most obvious one is monetary policy. So the finance industry acts as the transmission mechanism for monetary policy, and the government's effectively using the finance industry again as its transmission mechanism for climate policy as well. So basically hoping that via the funding routes and credit routes, it will actually then have an impact on reducing funding into areas of high emissions and so on. So, but I think it comes back to the bit that's missing is on the positive side. Once again, there's no the policy on the policy front. Again, it's all looking at the risk factors. It's not looking at the positives, and the policies are not there to drive the investment. It's just there to drive the reduction of investment in emission-heavy industries. So I think that that's a key area, I think, where the finance industry could engage with government is actually on the investment side to push for more policy to drive the investment side of the equation. So I think the governments generally see the finance industry as a good mechanism for driving policy, but quite too often it's actually one-sided, and I think we need to say again, we talk about the balance between risks and opportunities. I think again we need to see that on the policy front as well.
So completely agree, and actually heat decarbonisation is a very obvious and well covered example of this. So decarbonisation of the built environment, there is a lot of focus on the amount of money that's going to be needed to make that happen. So the Scottish Government talks about 33 billion needed by 2030, I think it is. But that money needs to come from somewhere. That money needs to be stimulated. And at the moment, the policy framework is not there to make it happen, which is why we're sort of stuck in this very slow progress in terms of decarbonising our buildings and the way that we heat them. And what we certainly are seeing is that, we are incredibly interested in ways of addressing this, but at the moment it tends to be quite piecemeal, so it's on a project-by-project basis. And because of the complexity of getting into a building, retrofitting it, changing the heat source, actually we're not seeing the wide-scale change that would need to happen. So ultimately policy needs to act as that lever to make the changes happen, because otherwise the finance simply is not going to be able to flow into it.
That's really important. Libby, while you've got the mic, you talked about the just transition, and obviously, we think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And I think more so, we think that if we don't have a just transition, politically, it won't be possible to have the transition at all. And I think that's one of the major reasons why we think it's such an important topic to focus on, obviously, as well as the impact that this can have on people and communities. But how do we achieve that just transition without slowing down the pace of the transition overall? I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, we can't do this quickly because, X, Y, Z people are going to be impacted. And so it ends up just almost a stalemate, which obviously we can't have. I think Theodor made a really good point earlier, saying, are we putting the oil and gas workers ahead of everyone else in the world that's going to be negatively impacted, which I think is a really important point. So how do we make the just transition possible without slowing down the transition overall?
Yeah, and completely agree on the point that we don't have a transition if it's not just, because it won't be sustainable. And for clarity, because I know different people have different interpretations of the term just transition, when I'm talking about just transition, what I mean is equal access to the benefits of transition, so the opportunities that can come from it, but also equal protection, if you like, from the potential downsides of change, and making sure that no groups are disproportionately negatively impacted. So it's important for me that we're thinking about it through those two lenses. I guess in Scotland, if I take Scotland as an example, and obviously, yes, we do have a significant oil and gas workforce, and there's a huge focus on the northeast in particular in terms of the concept of just transition, certainly as it's spoken about in political terms. We do have some opportunities when it comes to offshore wind, for example. So, we've got the ScotWind licensing coming up, and we've got the build out of ScotWind. So there are areas within offshore wind where I think we have an opportunity to get an advantage on the global stage. So floating offshore wind, which is a huge proportion of ScotWind, is actually an area that is relatively nascent internationally. So it may well be that we have an opportunity to build a supply chain in Scotland that puts us on the front foot, whereas there are other sectors, other types of offshore wind even, where that international supply chain already exists, and therefore we are going to face too much competition. So I think we need to look to the areas where there is that potential gap, if you like, internationally, and then think about how do we harness the skills that we already have within that oil and gas space, notwithstanding the fact that, yes, this is a just transition for everyone, but, coming back to that point around how do we make sure that the progress doesn't stall, let's think about how we harness the strengths that we already have within the expertise within oil and gas, but pivot towards areas where actually Scotland has a potential advantage.
And what areas are they? And specifically, would you say the kind of core? What is Scotland's economic contribution to the net zero transition, and where can Scotland be really strong on that? I think there's some obvious ones, but keen on your thoughts on what those are, and then maybe go.
Yeah, I mean, obviously floating offshore wind is a huge part in the supply chain around that. There's obviously a lot of technical expertise that has been built up within the oil and gas industry around design and engineering, which again we have a significant international reputation for, which it's, to me, seems like an obvious platform for harnessing as we go forward.
Just wanted to maybe get us to think a bit in the extreme. If we have a large investor manage to, let's say, change the board of a fossil fuel, effectively fire the CEO for mismanagement of the transition pathway, right? We wouldn't expect the CEO to claim benefits for it, right? They're already really well paid, but they've been fired for mismanaging it. And I think we need to make the distinction between the decision makers in fossil fuel companies and the actual workers that have a job in the North Sea. And ultimately, yes, you want to protect the people, but phase out the business model. And it is the business model that at the top has captured politics, has captured finance, and lobbies to stay in business. And we, you know, whenever people say we want them out of business, I think, or at least I would mean, we need to change, the leadership needs to move into the right direction. And yeah, ironically, on the offshore wind side, so I understand there's a huge opportunity for offshore wind with hydrogen, so green hydrogen, that's actually brought to shore via the old oil pipelines. So yes, there are these ironic, I think, opportunities, if you will, to create new economies. To, you know, so in the heat aspect, you may be able to get there a bit sooner.
Is carbon capture and storage an industry for Scotland's future? Oh, it's back to the hard questions in ESG again.
I mean, the challenge with a lot of the technologies that have this huge capex that maintain an industry that, or a resource that's, you know, outside petrochemicals, it's honestly replaceable from a technological perspective. And of course, some heating, which we're having a hard time to do, then, you know, you're still wondering, is this just a delay tactic? Like, we need to be smart about it as well, because it's a system that doesn't want to change, and it's normal. They're resisting to it. But, you know, is this, you know, are some of the things that are put on the table really real solutions, right? Which is what you're asking. And I just doubt, given the high capital cost and the fact that we can't solve leakage, methane leakage on the value chain. It seems very hard.
Really interesting. Ian, thoughts on just transition and kind of future industry areas?
Yeah, I think the just transition is extremely important for the reason you've just given, but also for another reason as well, which is they're sort of linked, but it comes back to the driving forces of the transition, and the fact that it's policy driven. So the population is being asked to change their lifestyles quite dramatically in a very short space of time. And that obviously has, you know, huge implications, and obviously you want to keep the population on board so that happens, so, you know, the transition happens. And, but also, when we look at changes, the changes of this magnitude throughout history when they've happened, they've usually been technology driven. They've been led by technology. And so it's been driven by consumer demand for that new technology. So new technology becomes available, which is desirable. It's actually improving people's lifestyles often, improving sort of working standards and so on. And so it's desirable to adopt that new technology, so people will actually be willing to do it, and quite often it's cost effective as well. So there's usually a lot of positives driving change. But here we have something which is not technology driven, it's policy driven. In fact, the technology, as we just heard, in some cases actually is not quite there yet for that transition to happen. And we're being asked to make this change by policymakers. So in that respect, I think it is absolutely key that we have a just transition policy in place alongside the transition plans itself, because the dynamics are just so different. And it's not until we see technology catching up and that technology becomes desirable, becomes cost effective, then that, I think, is when you start to see the momentum behind the transition actually really starting to pick up. So the dynamics of the transition has to change. It's currently policy-led. It's actually going to change. It's got to become technology-led and then consumer-led. And so the consumers want to adopt the new technology. They want to upgrade their homes to new heating systems. They want to upgrade their transport to more climate efficient forms of transport. So you need to put the technology in place for people to be able to adopt it, want to make the changes, not to be asked to change because of policy.
And it's so interesting you mentioned technology, because technology drives transitions independently of government, and you could argue that the dot-com boom, and possibly that we're also right at the very start of the next huge transition, which is AI, and what that does to jobs and communities could be vastly exceed anything that switching out of oil and gas could achieve, and those two transitions happening in parallel could be really, really challenging, I suppose. And I don't know if there's any thought being given to that at the moment, but Libby, just while we got a question, a top voted question at the moment is from Callum Richardson. What specifically is being looked at for Aberdeen? Because Aberdeen, as a place, as a city, stands to be really negatively impacted as the oil and gas kind of capital of the UK. What's the policy role for government around Aberdeen?
So I guess there's a few things happening in and around Aberdeen, and obviously, if you've ever been to Aberdeen, you will know that the second you step foot there, it is oil and gas through and through. You feel the importance of the industry for the people there. So it is absolutely critical that this is done in a very thoughtful and managed way. Obviously, Aberdeen is actually very focused on hydrogen as a potential, particularly if you look at their buses, for example. So they're sort of thinking about new ways of harnessing renewable energy to almost kind of pivot towards other ways of doing things. In terms of the transition of the workforce, certainly what we're seeing is an increasing number of businesses thinking about how do they bring renewables in as part of their business strategy. So we're actually seeing parts of the supply chain beginning to pivot away from oil and gas and towards renewables. Now, I guess the critical point to make here is that is a transition. So this isn't you switch it off and then suddenly you have no more revenue coming from oil and gas and it's all renewables. It's happening over time. But what we expect to see is that these businesses will see a shift away from the majority of their revenue coming from oil and gas, which is what has historically been the case and is required for their business to exist, towards much more renewable as part of their revenue mix. And I think what's interesting is that because we're starting to see this happening more and more now, that suggests to me that there is this kind of, maybe we're not at the tipping point quite yet, but I think we are moving certainly towards it, or there are good positive signs that businesses understand that in order to be able to survive, they can see that the direction of travel is towards renewables. And so they're building that into their business strategies at this point in order to be able to get first mover advantage. And part of the reason for that is you've got this kind of confluence of different factors. I mean, it's partly to do with social license, that there are all sorts of reputational considerations when it comes to continuing your association with oil and gas, but there are also, policy. Yes, it's not there, but it is starting to get built out, the regulatory framework as well. So because we've got this confluence of factors, I think businesses can see that that is the direction of travel, and therefore they feel more confident to make that change within their business strategy.
And I think that is something that policymakers underestimate, is the extent to which statements, noise being made by political leaders actually does influence business strategies. And I think that's underestimated massively.
I completely agree. Business is listening.
Yeah.
right? And they will respond if they see that it is going to be either positively or negatively impactful for their strategies and for their continued existence.
And another area that Theodor and Ian that we need to start thinking about is not just where the money comes from, but what are all the other issues and challenges that we face. Skills is possibly, right up there. Planning reform maybe is something needed. The BBC this morning was running a story that there are, by their estimate, £200 billion worth of projects, renewable projects in a queue to get grid connections. So how do we start, which is seems completely insane to me, and the National Grid saying they need to, completely rejig how they work. How do we solve some of these more fundamental issues? Because it comes back to the risk point. If you can't connect your wind farm to the grid, that's ultimate risk. You're just not able to generate anything. So and of course that is going to stop flows of capital. So how do we address some of these broader issues in a way that unlocks capital? Ian, Theodor.
I'm happy to think a bit, but also just frame a bit the emissions story in the Scotland context. So we've established that Scotland has big scope 3 emissions because we're exporting oil and gas, right? But if you look territorially, actually the biggest source of emissions is transport, right? And then you follow agriculture and then heating. So if you are, and then actually energy supply from a Scottish perspective is not an issue. As we've established, grid intensity is really low. We have some of the best people working in the electricity sector, particularly in here. So maybe what to reflect a bit on more on the positive side, what you could do with these other industries. The issue with transport, with agriculture, including heating, is that we have this huge fragmentation. You can't take the same approach as you would, deal with the supply side. We're talking about the demand side. And here, I think, from a banking perspective, again, primary capital markets perspective, it's really important that we kickstart the data sets part. How do we actually finance the transition at the more product level? How do you even engage with farmers in Scotland? What do we mean by managing farms, herds, and so on? And these are not, these link with policy, but link with a very different financial services, the banking part, the very relationship banking part, which is not this concerted investor action that we would normally talk within even UKSIF context. So I think we need to get deeper into these issues and theories of change. And I think Libby has the luxury from a more kind of private equity, primary capital market perspective. And that's why I think we need to focus a lot primary capital markets, understand that. And, if it becomes then apparent that we have huge fragmentation and that you can't invest because you can't aggregate a green bond at the level of housing associations in Scotland, then you need to work out a way in which government or Edinburgh City Council or someone issues that and then disburses them in a smart way. There are no, I think, easy solutions for that. We need to do the work. That's my own reflection, of course.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. If we're running into the kind of issues you're describing there, where you can't even connect up wind farms to the grid, then obviously that sort of defeats the whole object, and trying to generate investment into those projects is going to start to run into real trouble if that isn't the case. Because if that's being funded by impact bonds, and obviously you're having no impact at the end of the day, so it's difficult to justify. So yeah, no, it does. We've heard a lot over the last couple of days joined up thinking, and lack of is what seems to be one of the issues here. So yeah, so there's plenty of projects, and the investment seems to be there. It's just getting that investment into those projects and making sure those projects are effective and and do the job they're meant to be doing to deliver the transition. So I think it needs everyone to be working together. So obviously you mentioned planning. So obviously there's government agencies involved. There's going to be financing intermediaries involved. There's going to be the end investor involved. Everybody needs to be. All of that needs to be joined up for this to work.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. We've got a couple of quick-fire questions as we're running towards the end. Two questions to ask you. What do you see as the realistic timescale for the shift away from oil and gas to alternative sources? And then secondly, where are there other places that are actually providing a really positive example? Who's a good role model in terms of other places around the world? You can take one or both of those. Theodor.
I can try, but maybe I can indirectly answer the question. It's a great question, but maybe answer it at a higher level. And let's talk about conflicts of interest. If you want a good example, you can say Ireland said no to oil and gas exploration because they don't have many, assets left. So you have a lot of these claims as we don't do it, but we can't because we don't have the assets, right? There's a conflict of interest and there's a conflict with the job. So in the North Sea, this year, the revenue, so the tax revenue, increased about 7 times from pre-pandemic levels. It's 3.2 billion, just the tax revenue coming from the North Sea. And yet we have 30 billion capex investment to get more. Right, so there is no realistic shift away now, although production is slightly declining. If you look at some of the numbers, with the price of energy that goes quite high. So if you have this conflict of interest of, tax revenue, we need to understand how do we generate these alternative tax revenues, and it'll have to be through other industries and so on. So I would say, let's just reflect why would politicians do this.
So are you saying that because of these inherent conflicts, we're actually not going to make the shift away from oil and gas until it runs out?
Not that we need to deal with, understand them and find ways to bypass them, right? Whether it's through engaging, you could have indirectly pension funds can engage their members or educate, everyone who has a pension in, let's say my own university, we have a USS pension, right? There is no course, or USS is not engaging with any of the academics to say, here's, what we think should be climate action and how, there are ways in which you could get to that, indirectly get to people, get to voters, change attitudes, and it doesn't always have to be with, I probably wouldn't expect USS to have a position on how to engage with the government on fossil fuels, but I would love to, but there are other ways in which...
I think we're all going to have to start being actually much more proactive in our engagement with government. And I think that's something that we're starting to do. We're building up our, dramatically enhancing our government engagement process at the moment and capacity at the moment in UKSIF. But it's not just going to be us that can do this, because we would say it. And, because we've got sustainable in our organization name. We actually need the mainstream industry to say, do you know what, guys? We want to be part of a sustainable future. We see this as a core part of our business model. We need government to help us in XYZ areas so that we can do this more effectively, but ultimately this is the direction of travel we want to go in, and I think the more USS and every other mainstream voice in this room is able to say that to government, I think the stronger that narrative becomes.
Fully agree.
I guess particularly when you know that ultimately government is looking to the financial services industry at large to deliver on its policy, but actually the framework isn't there for the financial services industry to do what it needs to do in order to make that happen.
We're in the wings waiting to go. We need the frameworks in place, and it comes back to your point, the opportunities and the risks. So Ian, I'm going to give you the last word on this panel.
Yeah, I think so we talked about the climate transition, but it also is a broader economic transition. So those lost revenues have to replace with something else. So the climate transition, basically, so domestically we've lowered our grid emissions and changed our power source to renewables, but we need to replace the economic or address the economic impact as well. So the loss of revenues from that particular industry. So it's not just a climate transition; it's got to be an economic transition as well.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good place to end it. That was a fantastic conversation. We could, continue this in so many more angles, and I had so many more other questions to answer, but that was really fantastic. Thank you so much, Libby, Theodor, and Ian. That was a great panel.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a few weeks with another episode of the UKSIF Leadership Podcast. Keep an eye on our Twitter or our LinkedIn for updates. In the meantime, please follow us and rate us on whichever platform you're using. See you next time.